It's the height of the Cold War. The space race has already started. And the Soviet Union has launched the world's first satellite, Sputnik.
Sputnik was launched on a rocket, and people understood that if the Soviet Union had the capability to launch things into space, that there was likelihood that they also had the capability to launch warheads.
There's no doubt that Sputnik 1 scared the Americans to death, and they suddenly realized they had to pull their finger out and get on it.
Russia had got the first object into space, they got the first animal into space, and they got the first person into space. And the Americans, with their technical superiority, or so they thought, felt on the back foot.
Kennedy decides the way to beat the Soviets is to put a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I was thrilled to be part of fulfilling President John F. Kennedy's dream of man on the moon by the end of the decade. However, the moon was so far away, so remote. Was this really going to happen?
When Kennedy made that beautiful speech, we choose to go to the moon. Remember that from an engineering perspective, we did not know how to do that.
President Kennedy set out the challenge to do it in the 60s, and everybody devoted their total life to doing that.
Realizing Kennedy's dream within the decade isn't easy. It takes a concerted national effort, unparalleled in peacetime.
The scale of Project Apollo is hard to really even conceive of. At the peak, over 400,000 people were involved. The program cost, at the time, $25 billion, which was more than the Manhattan Project, more than the Panama Canal.
I think it was George H.W. Bush who said that it was the best investment since Leonardo da Vinci had been given a sketchbook. And he's right.
NASA's space program needs more than money. It needs men willing to risk their lives piloting highly experimental spacecraft. In 1961, Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space. In 1962, John Glenn orbits the Earth. By the time projects Mercury and Gemini give way to Apollo in the mid-60s, America's astronauts are superstars.
Most of us came from the military, where we'd been almost incognito, and all of a sudden you're celebrities.
I thought these guys were the coolest guys walking the planet. You know, this is the time the Beatles were around. I thought they were cooler than the Beatles.
I wouldn't call it a rock star quite, but you could get a real swell head if you didn't watch out because you got a lot of attention.
Fannie Lou Hamer was born the last of 20 children to a family of Mississippi sharecroppers.
Growing up in the Mississippi Delta, she thinks, well, voting could help change my economic circumstances, and so I am going to try and go and register to vote.
She isn't allowed to register. Just for attempting it, she is fired from her job of 18 years and put out of her home. But she persists, becoming a voter and an activist.
The bus that she's in gets stopped, and all of the people who are with her who are trying to register to vote, they are removed from the bus.
Once again, women asking for their democratic rights are thrown in jail.
3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was State Highway Patrol. He said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead."
She is physically assaulted to the point that that assault has lifelong effects on her.
This time, there is no public outcry. President Johnson pays no attention. But Hamer does not back down. Instead, she launches a campaign for the U.S. Senate. Though the longest of long shots in a district where only 5% of African Americans are registered to vote, she uses the platform to raise her voice.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
In 1964, Hamer speaks at the National Democratic Party convention in Atlantic City.
We want to register to become first class citizen. And if the freedom...
She told the story of what was happening to black people in their quest for their natural-born right to vote.
Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?
She used her platform to tell a story that I don't think many people in the nation knew.
She recognized that if the South was going to change, it was going to change at the hands of people like her.
1 year later, Congress passes a law to enforce the 19th and 15th Amendments, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
As much as we want the story of voting rights, not just for women, but for everyone in the United States, to be a forward trajectory, there are always new barriers that people find ways to put up.
There's no better way to understand the true spirit of Illinois than to understand how the skyline of the city of Chicago was born. How it managed to rise from the ashes and touch the sky after one of the most devastating tragedies ever to befall a U.S. city. A tragedy known as the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It started on October 8th in the southwest of Chicago, in a barn at what is now 137 DeKoven Street. High winds from the southwest fanned the flames and pushed the fire through the city towards Lake Michigan. By the time rain showers finally put the fire out, almost 2 days later, over 4 square miles of the city had been burned to the ground. More than 17,000 buildings were destroyed, 90,000 residents were homeless, and close to 300 were dead. The Great Chicago Fire had started at 9 p.m., which is one reason the tragedy has been called the night America burned. Some say that even before the bricks stopped smoking, the people of Chicago vowed to come back, even bigger than before. And that's just what they did. Chicago's Great Fire was the spark that led to brilliant innovations in the skyscraper and the creation of one of the most dazzling skylines in the world. What first kicked off Chicago's vertical boom was land prices. Almost immediately after the Great Chicago Fire, the cost of land in the city skyrocketed as builders vied for space. Those who did have land wanted to build the tallest structures they could. It just so happened that new building materials were about to make that possible. The one that had the biggest impact was structural steel. It allowed engineers to design taller than ever before by using a skeleton of steel instead of thick walls of stone. It also enabled architects to revolutionize the way buildings looked. The interior steel skeleton made it possible to use large plate glass windows on the outside, which quickly became the norm. When German architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe arrived in Chicago just before World War II to teach here at the Illinois Institute of Technology, he pushed the use of glass and steel in skyscrapers even further. His students went on to design some of Chicago's most important structures, including Lake Point Tower, with its signature curving facade.
1957. 70 miles from Venice, amid the cliffs and gorges of Italy's VAJONT River Valley, work begins on the VAJONT hydroelectric dam. Crucial to the dam's operation is a vast reservoir that can hold 44 billion gallons of water. Ever since the filling of the reservoir in early 1960, enormous cracks have begun appearing on Mount Tauk above the dam.
People could sense that something big was about to happen because the ground was moving, as suddenly new cracks would appear, very deep and very large.
Then, in late 1960, another warning sign. This time, it's a landslide. though relatively small, it prompts a flurry of scientific research. What it confirms is shocking. As a direct result of filling the reservoir, Mount Tauk has become waterlogged, dislodging a 720 million ton chunk of rock that is now slowly slipping down the mountain towards the lake below. And so in 1962, the authorities lower the water by over 70 feet. At that level, they are confident the dam can't be overtopped, provided the landslide falls into the reservoir at the speed they expect. Even as locals grow uneasy, officials remain confident that the threat is minimal.
No one had been warned in Longarone. There were no official warnings. There were just the warnings coming from the mountain.
October 9th, 1963. Traveling at over 60 miles an hour, 3 times faster than expected, the 1.5 mile wide chunk of rock is finally unleashed. In its sights, the enormous VAJONT reservoir.
How can you imagine? 9 billion cubic feet of rock, breaking away from a mountain and falling into a basin filled almost to the brim.
It sends 2 giant waves in opposite directions, one towards the dam, the other towards the village of Erto. Traveling at over 30 miles an hour, the first wave engulfs farms and houses all along the shore, killing most of their occupants. Shielded by a spur in the mountain, the village of Erto is miraculously spared the worst of the wave. At the opposite end of the reservoir, the second tsunami is now hurtling towards the VAJONT Dam. It sends more than 275 million tons of water over the edge and into the valley below. In its crosshairs, nearly 5,000 inhabitants of Longarone, with nowhere to run. The town is gone, reduced to little more than mud and rubble. Of the town's 372 buildings, just 22 are still standing. The rest flattened and washed away down the Piave River towards Venice.
Longarone was not there anymore. They could see that Longarone didn't exist anymore. There was only mud and water and ruins and no life at all.
The VAJONT disaster claimed almost 2,000 lives, making it one of the worst man-made disasters in history.
In 1794, President George Washington chose Harper's Ferry as the site for a new armory that would also manufacture arms and munitions for the U.S. Army. He knew that the Shenandoah River's currents could power the mills necessary to make weapons. The remains of those mills still line the river just below this historic town. But as the Civil War edged closer in the mid-1800s, Harper's Ferry proved that it might not be the safest place for a U.S. armory. And the first threat didn't come from Confederate troops. It came as a surprise ambush from a now legendary abolitionist, a man some say was America's very first terrorist. On the night of October 16, 1859, a white man named John Brown and 18 of his anti-slavery supporters approached Harper's Ferry from Maryland to the northeast and captured the town's bridges. Their mission was to launch an assault on the U.S. Armory, steal a cache of weapons, and use them to arm runaway slaves so they could launch their own attacks on slave owners and foment a rebellion. When Brown and his men arrived in Harper's Ferry, they were all armed and ready to die for their abolitionist cause. They quickly stormed the armory and started taking hostages. But almost immediately, the plan started to go terribly wrong. A passenger train happened to pull into Harper's Ferry, and Brown's men stopped it, but then decided to allow it to continue on. When the train later arrived in Baltimore, passengers alerted authorities that Harper's Ferry was under attack. By then, Brown had moved his hostages here to this brick building, the Armory's fire engine house. The next morning, as the sun rose over Harper's Ferry, townspeople and local militia began firing on Brown's men. 4 of them tried to escape by swimming across the rivers, but they were shot dead in the water. And the worst was yet to come. About 24 hours after the siege began, 90 U.S. Marines arrived from Washington by train. Under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, the Marines stormed the engine house, freed the hostages, and captured Brown and his men. When it was over, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry cost 17 lives, including 10 of Brown's men, several townspeople, and the mayor of Harper's Ferry. John Brown was convicted of treason and sentenced to death.
It's 1866, and in a remote laboratory in Germany, Alfred Nobel is on a personal crusade to make nitroglycerin safer. The deadly explosive has already killed his brother. Now, according to legend, another near disaster sets him on the path to his greatest discovery. A beaker of nitroglycerin is knocked to the floor.
He should have been killed in the accident.
Nobel is convinced that something on the floor must have prevented detonation.
Nobel did a series of trial and error experiments where he mixed nitroglycerin with different substances in a systematic way to try to find which one would make it more stable without making it less explosive.
This search becomes his obsession. And when he finds the answer, it's right beneath his feet. An absorbent clay-like substance found along the riverbanks of the Elbe. Called Kieselguhr, it contains the fossilized remains of a hard-shelled algae. When mixed 75% nitroglycerin to 25% Kieselguhr, the silica in the Kieselguhr absorbs the nitroglycerin, preventing the decomposition that made it so unstable.
What he had then was a product that was safer than nitroglycerin, and you can burn it, you can throw it around, and it won't explode.
Swedish inventor Alfred Nobel has successfully created the world's first safe explosive, dynamite. Through patents and licensing, he amasses a $265 million fortune. But in 1888, his life and everything he's achieved is turned upside down.
Alfred Nobel's life was tainted when he read an obituary.
It should be for Alfred's brother, Ludwig, who has just died. But the newspaper makes an error. Alfred Nobel is reading his own obituary.
The obituary said that Alfred Nobel had been a merchant of death who had manufactured explosives and just made the world a worse place.
A number of terrorist incidents using dynamite have created a dark legacy.
During his lifetime, Alfred Nobel was reviled for inventing dynamite because it was this destructive, explosive form of weaponry.
The obituary rocks Nobel, but it also gives him a last chance of redemption. In 1895, he changes his will, donating almost his entire fortune to create a foundation that will forever link his name to life instead of death.
He started a fund that should give out prizes to people that had, as he said, conferred the greatest benefit to mankind.
Called the Nobel Prize, it will honor those that further human understanding and peace, from statesmen to scientists.
Those were the true heirs of Nobels, and those are the people that still today win the Nobel Prize.
This was not a smooth ride down the river, as we say. Myself and the engineers went to Los Angeles to meet with Gehry Partners as they proudly showed us their model of the building, what they intended to build. And they did a very, very long exposition. And they finished by saying, well, what do you think? And the structural engineer next to me thought for a second and then said, I think you used a lot of glue to make your model stand together.
Gehry's glue-happy model makers had good reason not to confront the question of how to build it. The design's sheer originality meant there was no structural template to follow, nothing to suggest it was actually possible. But Cowie's team took a logical approach to planning the build.
It's a very tricky and complex building, geometrically, obviously, when you see it from the outside. You could break it down to 4 basic systems that put the building together.
The engineers devised a solution that was based on illusion. The huge glass sails appear to be supported by the small curving structures known as the icebergs. A signature of Frank Gehry designs, they look like the core of the building, but they're not. Melt away the icebergs, and some very conventional concrete cubes emerge, within which are the gallery spaces themselves. Now, these are not very Gehry, but they are very solid and allow the building's outer skin of sails to be so extreme.
It's just after 5 a.m. in Jakarta, Indonesia, as 181 passengers settle in for a short domestic flight. Lion Air Flight 610 is a 90-minute journey from Jakarta over the Java Sea to Bangka Island. At 6:20,
rotate.
The MAX 8 lifts off the runway at Jakarta. But immediately there's trouble. The captain's control yoke starts shaking, a warning that the plane is about to stall.
Takeoff config.
Okay, but what?
The pilots can't identify the source of the problem. They have no choice but to continue climbing.
Lion 610, fly heading 248.
And follow standard instrument departure.
Lion Air 610.
The air traffic controller has no idea that there's an issue in the cockpit. The pilots get a warning that their airspeed indicators do not agree.
Airspeed disagree. What's going on? Should we request a return to Jakarta?
Landing gear up.
Lion 610.
Climb to flight level 270.
Still unaware of any trouble, the controller instructs the crew to continue climbing to 27,000 feet.
Altitude disagree.
The first officer now notices that the altimeters also show conflicting readings.
Acknowledged, altitude disagree.
The situation is deteriorating quickly. Now flying 5,000 feet above the sea, Captain Sinasia struggles to keep the plane's nose up.
Flight path vector may be unreliable.
Lion 610, turn right, heading 070 to avoid traffic ahead.
Set the pitch attitude. Roger, heading 070.
Flight 610 is flying erratically over the Java Sea and becoming increasingly more difficult to control. Controller allows Flight 610 to fly at any altitude the pilots choose.
Please clear 3,000 above and below of traffic.
Okay, will do. What
altitude would you like?
It's diving.
It's diving.
It's okay.
Flight 610 is now speeding towards the sea, and the pilots are out of options.
Fly up. Up. Up.
30 minutes after crashing into the Java Sea, the wreckage of Lion Air Flight 610 is located. There are no survivors.
So Houdini is already sick with what could be deliberate poisoning and the onset of appendicitis. I want to take a closer look at the next key date on Houdini's stage tour, October 11th, 1926. It's just 20 days before he dies. Houdini is in Albany, New York, where he has the next in a series of bizarre misfortunes. This time, a disaster involving his most notorious invention.
Ah, Dave,
Hello
there
again.
you are. What is this?
This is a water torture cell. This was invented by Houdini as a really nasty escape. This was a sealed unit. There was no false bottom. It had water in it, maybe up to here. Houdini would be shackled by his ankles into the lid, locked securely. He would then be hoisted high, upside down.
So he's chained, he's lowered into this tank full of water, and then he has to escape.
Absolutely. Curtain draws across, and so the struggle begins. So he would ask the audience to hold their breath, see how long they could do it. You'd hear gasps from the audience after 30 seconds, a minute.
Wow.
2, 3 minutes. The audience would be whipped into a frenzy. They'd be demanding that the two stagehands with big axes go and break in, release him. Houdini's going to drown.
For years and years and years, people thought that's how he died, in the water torture cell. But that is a complete myth invented by the movie Houdini in 1953 with Tony Curtis.
The incomparable Houdini, who amazed the world with his fantastic exploits.
The director famously created a better death for him. In that movie, he dies in the water torture cell.
The water cell may not have killed him, but like most of his tricks, it was incredibly dangerous.
He actually was doing things that were very much on the cutting edge. There was real risk, but he mitigated almost all of that risk by being smart and planning ahead and being very exacting in how he did his illusions.
Houdini's most favorite phrase, "My brain is the key that sets me free." No fear. When everything looks like you're not going to be able to get out, you're not going to be able to escape life's challenges, relax, calm down, and let your brain figure your way out.
So here we have the lid. How did he do it?
This is my take on it.
Okay.
As he was lowered in and the lid was put on top, his two assistants made the secret move.
All right,
If you look
I'm ready.
at the hinge there, there's a pin.
Oh, yeah.
And you can just ease it out, pull it out.
Look at that.
The curtain would then drop.
Okay.
Houdini could push with his feet.
Oh, wow.
It lifts. He could climb out, close the lid behind him.
Impressive, really impressive. I mean, him holding his breath wasn't a trick, though.
No, not at all. And having the agility and suppleness to be able to turn around in that small, confined space takes some doing as well.
Yeah.
And then have the strength remaining to pull yourself out.
Absolutely, it is incredible.
Houdini, after figuring out that he could fail at some of these tricks and that could cost him his life, usually built in fail-safes. So he would always have like kind of a way out. So he usually had a backup plan if he couldn't escape from something. The water torture cell, that could cost him his life. There are a lot of ways things could go wrong, even if you do have a fail-safe.